If you look at lists of the most traded commodities in the world, it looks about how you would expect it to. Oil at the top of the list, followed by things like natural gas, gold, cotton, but also one that seems maybe a bit out of place: coffee. Coffee is the second most traded physical good in the world by some measures, which seems odd for a luxury. It's not something anyone needs to survive. But coffee's position on that list isn't an accident or fluke. It's a result of centuries of colonial agriculture and economic policies and modern industrial commodification. The coffee plant is originally from the Ethiopian highlands, where it grew mostly unknown until the 10th century. Arab traders were the first to popularize it as a drink, though in a much different form than the coffee we know today. The original beverage was more like a tea, where coffee leaves and whole coffee berries were ground together and mixed with boiling water to create a sweet drink. It became widespread throughout the Muslim world, consumed as a social drink. It wasn't until coffee reached Europe around the 1600s that it truly became a global commodity. The roasted style of coffee, the kind most common today, was developed during this period when the drink spread across the continent. Initially, coffee gained traction among the wealthy as a form of medicine. This was somewhat controversial, however, and many Catholic priests requested that Pope Clement VIII ban the Muslim drink. The Pope, upon tasting coffee, however, said it was too delicious to be left to the infidels and decided to fool Satan by baptizing it as a Christian drink. It didn't take long for coffee to become trendy throughout broader European society. London, Vienna, and Paris all had their own coffee culture and thousands of coffee houses by the 1700s. The demand was explosive, but there was a problem. Coffee doesn't grow in Europe. Yemen and Ethiopia, the two biggest producers of coffee at this time, also weren't keen to give up their duopoly on the world's trendiest drink. So, Europe did what it did best at this time and turned to colonialism to solve this issue. The Dutch were the first to notice the potential commercial viability of coffee as a crop. Their first coffee plantations were established in Ceylon in 1658. Large plantations across Java, Sumatra, Timor, and pretty much every Indonesian island followed soon after. These were so productive and profitable that for about 50 years, the Dutch had nearly total control over coffee supply and prices. The French would be their first serious competitors when coffee was planted on the island of Reunion in 1718. This would be followed by its introductions to Martinique and French Guiana. While early French production couldn't come close to matching that of the Dutch, specific coffee strains developed in French colonies were generally considered of superior quality and taste. France might have regretted bringing coffee to Guyana, however, as the plant was eventually smuggled across the border and into Brazil in 1727. It would take some time, but Brazil would eventually become the world's dominant coffee producer, a title it still holds today. That transformation took time, though, and to understand why, it's useful to understand the logistics of growing coffee. First off, coffee takes quite a long time between planting and harvesting. It takes around 3 to 5 years after being planted for a coffee tree to actually produce much coffee, so it's not like wheat or corn that you can plant and harvest within a single season. This long initial run-up time means it's very difficult for supply to match demand. There's also great risk to farmers. It's a very high initial investment for a pretty risky payoff. Coffee grows best around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and any temperature swings outside of a few degrees can damage or kill the plant. A few unlucky hot or cold days a year can send a whole coffee plantation back to square one, essentially. Coffee also requires lots of rainfall, ideally around 70 inches of rain per year. As if these two requirements weren't strict enough, coffee is also best when it's grown at elevations between 3,000 to 6,000 feet. But wait, there's more. Coffee also doesn't like direct sunlight. It grows best in the shade. Some varieties have been selectively bred to grow better in sun, but these usually require extra fertilizers and pesticides to thrive. Coffee in general requires lots of work to be processed, on top of all this effort just to get the plant to grow in the first place. The vast majority of coffee, even today, is picked entirely by hand. A skilled harvester can pick about 200 pounds of raw coffee cherries per day, with an average coffee tree yielding just 5 pounds per year. 6 pounds of raw fruit are needed to yield just 1 pound of green coffee beans, which lose an additional 20% of their weight when roasted. As if this doesn't already sound like a ton of effort, most of the processing for the beans needs to be done within 24 hours of harvesting, or the beans will begin to ferment and develop a bad taste. Processing is yet another tedious part of making coffee, where each step runs the risk of ruining the product. There are two main methods of processing, wet and dry. Dry is less resource-intensive, but more labor-intensive. The beans are spread thinly over a large area and flipped multiple times a day to dry in the sun. If done improperly, the beans develop mold and cannot be used. For the wet method, the raw cherries are left in tanks of water for 48 hours, which causes the parchment around the beans to fall off. They can then be dried in a rotating cylinder and then sorted by hand to remove any that got too damaged in the process. The inherent risks involved with coffee means the farmers are often trying to offload their crop as soon as they can, usually being forced to sell to shady middlemen known as coyotes for extremely low prices. Damn, that's a lot of work for all those coffee choices you have on the store shelves. The harsh geographical requirements, huge amounts of labor needed, and a bottomless demand in Europe and later North America made coffee a perfect fit as a colonial cash crop. No colony invested as much in coffee as Brazil. Brazil offered a perfect climate and amazing soil on nearly endless stretches of untouched land. While coffee first arrived in the north of the colony, it wasn't until the crop was brought down south to Rio de Janeiro in 1774 that it really took off. Here, amongst the terra roxa, or red clay of the area, the best land for growing coffee can be found. Brazil also solved coffee's labor problem, since the colony already had tons of slaves working the diamond and gold mines. The mines had become steadily depleted, however, so many were simply reassigned to work on the new coffee plantations. Over 6,000 miles of railroads were laid into the jungle for the purpose of bringing coffee to port and ultimately shipping internationally. Brazil's coffee production addiction would only intensify after the country became independent from Portugal in 1822. Under Emperor Pedro II, Brazilian coffee production would be so high that it kind of broke the demand problem. The new flood of Brazilian coffee onto the global market would crash prices and make coffee no longer just a drink for the upper class. Coffee replaced beer as the working class drink of choice across North America and Europe, with it becoming a vital stimulant for many working in factories. Coffee became so popular so quickly that it was considered an essential ration for soldiers in the American Civil War, with some rifles even having coffee grinders built into their stocks. Brazil grew so much coffee, it was part of the reason the country was the last in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, not until 1888. Slavery was quickly replaced with the colono system. This was a scheme that offered poor European immigrants, mainly Italians, their own tiny plot of land for subsistence farming on coffee plantations in exchange for their labor. This was a highly exploitative exchange that was ultimately even more profitable than slavery for the plantation owners. Thousands of acres worth of coffee trees were planted in the late 1800s as plantation owners jumped on the coffee bandwagon. The state of Sao Paulo alone contained over 500 million coffee trees by 1900. But there was a problem. Coffee prices were high because supply was so slow to catch up, but as this new wave of plants began to mature, prices crashed. Production in Brazil went from 5.5 million bags a year in 1890 to 16 million in 1901. While this might sound like a good thing on paper, these bags of coffee were now worth pennies at best, and the whole coffee industry was poised to implode. The Brazilian government wasn't blind to this possibility and stepped in to prevent a collapse. In 1906, the government bought literal tons of coffee for the sole purpose of putting it in warehouses indefinitely to create artificial scarcity. This successfully propped up prices, or in the terminology of the time, valorized prices, Brazil's coffee valorization scheme would essentially be the deciding factor on what a cup of joe would cost anywhere in the world for about 40 years. But it also partially backfired. While the industry didn't collapse, Brazil only became more dependent on it, and more people and plantations got invested in coffee. The valorization plan was seen by many as a sort of government insurance plan, ensuring that if you grew coffee, you would make money. When the Great Depression hit and demand for non-essentials plummeted, the government was left holding the bag, with 1.5 million tons of coffee in storage, more than the whole world consumed in a year. Some attempted to find other uses for the beans domestically. Experiments in turning coffee into plastics, perfume, wine, flour, and even fuel for trains were all conducted, but none had enough success to provide a real alternative use. Ultimately, much of the coffee in storage was burned, about 78 million bags worth from 1931 to 1944. The economic crisis was punctuated with a military coup in 1930, bringing Getulio Vargas to power, who centralized the economy and reined in the coffee oligarchy. A ban on planting any new coffee trees was implemented, and a trade deal swapping coffee for wheat from the United States was signed to immediately offload some of the surplus. There were also negotiations to potentially sell coffee to the Soviet Union in exchange for oil, but this never materialized. Brazil's attempts to keep prices artificially high would continue to bite them in the back as the 1930s continued. The relatively high price floor they had established, as well as sabotaging their own market share by reducing production, gave other coffee producers some room to experiment. Rivals couldn't match Brazilian quantity, but they could beat them in quality. Brazilian coffee was often considered harsh and off-tasting. The emphasis on high production meant Brazilian harvesters would employ crude methods, such as stripping entire coffee trees, including stems and branches, harming quality. Beans also often wouldn't dry properly, and the mild fermentation the product sometimes underwent gave the coffee an iodine-like taste. In cases where the beans looked too gray or pale, some producers would even dye the beans with toxic chemicals such as arsenic and chromate to better match consumer expectations. The issues with Brazilian coffee of the day created a gap in the market, one that would be filled by Colombia. Colombian coffee had long been sought after as an alternative to Brazilian coffee, especially in the United States. Coffee grown there tasted better for two reasons. One, the altitude was better. Most Brazilian plantations, about 95%, were under the ideal 3,000 feet for optimal flavor. Secondly, Colombian plantations were simply more selective in both their harvesting and processing, resulting in a milder and more tasty flavor. Colombian coffee was already popular by at least the 1920s, but the outbreak of World War II would give it a chance to expand its market share. The war cut off South American coffee producers from the huge European market, accounting for about half of global coffee consumption at that time. The US was concerned that some South American countries might start to get cozy with the Axis as coffee prices crashed and their economies were threatened. So, in 1940, the Inter-American Coffee Agreement was signed. This created a quota system where the US would attempt to import enough coffee to partially make up for the shortfall in demand. 16 million bags a year would be imported, not enough to totally replace the European market, but enough that prices didn't fall to totally absurd lows. Brazil was granted 60% of this quota, Colombia was given 20%, and the rest was made up by miscellaneous small producers in Asia and Africa. The American entry into the war created huge demand for coffee, as each American enlisted man was allocated a ration of 32 pounds of coffee per year. The drink became so closely associated with G.I. Joes that Cup of Joe became a nickname for it. The logistics of the war also meant new ways of storing and preparing coffee had to be invented, mainly instant coffee. When the war was over, many men returned with a new love of coffee, and demand for those beans reached all-time highs globally. There was an explosion of all things coffee in America in the late 40s, with things like coffee breaks and coffee machines becoming common, as well as instant coffee and pre-ground coffee appearing on store shelves. As coffee became ingrained in American culture more and more, market volatility and overall prices mattered more too. When a prolonged drought in late 1949 damaged the Brazilian crop, the surplus finally ran out and coffee prices doubled. It was such a big deal there was a congressional investigation into it in 1950. The investigation accused various Latin American governments of deliberately manipulating the market. The countries accused didn't take kindly to this, being essentially slandered for what was a natural market fluctuation. Prices would stay high through the 50s, after a highly unusual frost in Brazil killed 1.5 billion coffee trees, finally pushing the price of coffee over $1 a pound. This further hurt Brazilian market share and allowed African producers to expand. Côte d'Ivoire, Angola, and Kenya became major exporters of the Robusta variety, commonly used to make instant coffee. Robusta is the less popular variety, making up only about 30% of global consumption because of its inferior taste, but it has way less restrictive growing requirements, is more resilient against disease, and yields more beans per tree. Combined with a series of other mishaps in South America that cratered production, African coffee exports had a period of almost exponential growth. Prices were falling, so Brazil and Colombia panicked. The two desperately tried to coordinate with other Latin American coffee producers to keep prices high. The Organization of American States put out a report endorsing and encouraging such a plan, signed off on by the United States. How did America go from accusing these countries of running a coffee cartel to actually supporting one in the span of 6 years? Well, the answer is probably in the section of the report that warned economic instability could lead to opportunities for communist mischief makers. The US would send an observer to the 1958 Latin American Coffee Agreement meeting with the avowed mission of boosting consumption. While the Latin American producers agreed to a quota system amongst themselves to keep prices high, the African nations present refused to cut their own production. The biggest producers in Africa ultimately did join onto the agreement a year later, but this was basically meaningless since there was no enforcement mechanism and countries mostly did what they wanted. American concern and interest regarding communist influence in Latin America would be enlivened by the Cuban Revolution. While Cuba wasn't a huge coffee producer, it had an economy based around a handful of cash crops and could have been a model for revolutions in similar places. So, in 1961, JFK launched the Alliance for Progress, designed to improve the economy of Latin American states. One of the main ways this would be accomplished was the stabilization of commodity prices. The logic was simple: deliberately drive up the cost of coffee at home in America for the sake of steadying producer economies. This would sting a bit for consumers, but would probably be cheaper in the long run than fighting communist insurgencies or needing to prop up anti-Soviet governments directly. The coffee aspect of Kennedy's plan would be formalized under the UN in 1962 as the International Coffee Agreement. This was again a quota system meant to keep prices fairly high, but this time it had the backing of the UN, and by extension, actual coordination between suppliers and consumers. The two biggest producers, still Brazil and Colombia, were given the lion's share of the quota. Côte d'Ivoire and Angola, now the third and fourth biggest producers, were given the next biggest chunks, and other countries made up the rest. While there were import restrictions on the US and Western Europe to keep prices high, countries with low coffee consumption were allowed to import as much as they wanted. Places like China, Japan, and the Soviet Union could drink as much as they wanted. Despite the US being the country pushing for this agreement, there was significant domestic opposition. Congress dragged its feet on ratifying the treaty for about a year, correctly pointing out that this would be a cartel supported by the American consumer. Eventually, though, a law was passed requiring an International Coffee Agreement country of origin certificate for any imported coffee, essentially joining the agreement. This agreement became the International Coffee Organization, or ICO, headquartered in London. Certificates were how the agreement enforced itself, with every export of coffee now requiring documentation about its origin. This also allowed for regulation and quotas for specific kinds and varieties of coffee. While this was probably the best compliance mechanism so far, it was relatively easy to defeat. Those special countries that could import as much as they wanted saw a pretty obvious and lucrative loophole. Countries like the Soviet Union, which weren't required to issue certificates for export, simply imported coffee only to resell it to places like France and West Germany. Another issue was how the quotas were allocated. They were predetermined based on historical data. While existing coffee producers liked this, though many had disagreements about the exact share they deserved, it also really discouraged any small or new producers from getting into the market. The same issue also existed on the consumer side, where voting power in the organization was based on historical consumption. Although voting power was split evenly between consumer and producer nations, only a few countries actually had much sway because of this system. It didn't take long for more loopholes in the system to be found. Some countries issued invalid certificates, since according to the wording of the original agreement, coffee exports merely needed a certificate of some kind, but what type was left unspecified. This language was clarified in later versions of the agreement. Restrictions also only applied to unprocessed beans. This became a problem when Brazil built their own facilities for making instant coffee in the mid-60s. Previously, raw beans were mainly processed in consumer countries, but the new Brazilian-made varieties were both cheaper and better than those, using Arabica beans rather than Robusta. American roasters freaked out and were nearly able to derail the agreement's renewal in 1968. This was averted at the last minute, however, when to make up for this, the US was given permission to import some raw beans tax-free to make up for the lost revenue. While Latin American countries ultimately conceded in the negotiations, many were bitter over the American stance. The idea of America being okay with them growing the coffee, but getting upset with them trying to get in on the industrial side of things created a rift. The 1968 renewal was backdropped by a huge global surplus of coffee. In hopes of resolving this, the ICO set up a diversification fund to support farms that chose to grow something besides coffee. Brazil also began burning many of its coffee plantations to reduce supply. Coffee quotas were now set much more dynamically and could be changed easier, and they were split amongst different varieties of coffee. It didn't take long for there to be additional issues. Coffee prices began to steadily drop in the late 60s as a lingering oversupply problem and new producers in Africa and Asia drove down prices. Scared by this, some of the biggest producers convened their own informal group to maintain prices. Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, Ethiopia, Côte d'Ivoire, Uganda, and Portugal, representing Angola, created the Geneva Group in 1969. This was a cartel within a cartel, an informal agreement to cut their own exports to drive up prices. A lot of consumer countries weren't happy about this intentional squeeze, however. The Geneva Group kept trying to force export quotas down, while consumer countries wanted prices to be low. This disagreement ultimately led to the agreement lapsing in 1972, when producers and consumers couldn't come to a consensus on price targets. Coffee was suddenly allowed to be freely traded. Coffee and sugar futures, which had been stable in sleepy markets for years, sprang back to life. Both prospective buyers and speculators snapped up contracts for the coming years, though prices mostly stabilized by early 1973. Things were mostly fine for a couple years, but quickly enough, everyone had to learn the lesson again about why coffee was so closely regulated. A civil war in Angola, unrest in Burundi, an earthquake in Guatemala, an outbreak of the coffee rust disease in Honduras, and worst of all, a frost in Brazil that destroyed over half the coffee trees in the country led to prices quintupling in 1975. With renewed American concern about the spread of communism, everyone met again to bring the coffee agreement back in 1976. The new version of the agreement overhauled the quotas and encouraged producers to export as much as they could with coffee prices at all-time highs. Quotas were now allocated based on how much coffee countries exported relative to others. This encouraged smaller producers to step up production, especially in Africa and Central America. The new agreement also did away with the diversification fund. While the return of the agreement calmed fears and generally had more support than previous iterations, it still faced challenges. The 1970s had record levels of inflation, and many coffee-growing nations saw the organization's price targets as inadequate in the face of it. So, yet again, in 1978, there was another producer cartel formed, this time much more formally. This was the Bogota Group, composed of 8 Latin American countries and led by Salvadorian politician Ricardo Falla Cáceres. Instead of limiting their own production to drive up prices, these groups instead created a fund for playing the futures market. The group spent millions of dollars to buy up coffee futures contracts at insanely high prices to create the illusion of scarcity. The coffee that was subsequently shipped could then be sold for much steeper prices than normal. These market manipulations were carried out through a corporation established by the group in Costa Rica known as Pan Café. With a budget of $500 million, this company was effectively the one deciding global coffee prices, not the internationally agreed framework. The US wasn't blind to what was going on. After all, most of their manipulations were happening on the New York Coffee and Sugar Exchange, but there was very little American regulators could legally do about it. Eventually, American authorities settled for just arresting Cáceres when he visited New York. They explained he would not be allowed to leave the country unless he disbanded Pan Café, and in exchange, the US would rejoin the coffee agreement. Cáceres eventually agreed. The Reagan administration eventually and reluctantly ratified the new agreement, though it took until 1983. The US had somewhat lost interest in the agreement, as health concerns about caffeine had sharply reduced coffee consumption in the late 70s and early 80s. Reagan, however, saw it as a useful political tool. Reagan supported his pet project of antagonizing the Sandinista government in Nicaragua by successfully having Nicaraguan coffee banned by the International Coffee Organization, forcing the country to sell at low prices to non-member countries. Member countries being allowed to sell to non-members was a long-standing sticking point, one that more and more parties were getting upset about. The US especially was vocal about this, that non-members only paid half for coffee, but couldn't actually do anything about it. Reagan's free trade rhetoric clashed with Cold War realities of needing a way to keep a foot in the door in Latin America and Africa. But by the late 80s, the Soviet Union lacked both funds or the political will to back communist movements around the world as it once did. The geopolitical imperative the political West had to maintain the coffee system diminished, and logistical issues with quotas and complaints about prices only increased. Brazil, traditionally the center pillar of the coffee world, began to echo American doubts about artificial controls on coffee markets. Complaints from many countries were heard about coffee oligarchies, that this agreement meant to support coffee growers really just supported a wealthy elite. Politicians in producer countries and activists in consumer countries had both been demanding fairer deals on coffee exports. Furthermore, many smaller producers were losing market share to non-member states and became disillusioned about the economic benefit. Namely, they were losing to Vietnam. Vietnam's economic liberalization in the 1980s sparked a coffee-growing boom in the country, with coffee exports growing nearly exponentially and crashing global prices. Vietnam today is now the second biggest coffee producer, surpassing both Colombia and Indonesia. It was a combination of factors such as these that led to the International Coffee Agreement's quota system collapsing for the final time on July 4, 1989. At the final negotiations, most countries agreed they no longer saw a need for the system to continue, and all export limits and quotas were cancelled. The members voted to maintain a minimal level of funding, however, and the International Coffee Organization is still around today, though it exists more as a think tank than a regulatory body. The effects of the end of the quotas were immediate. Prices dropped sharply, basically halving overnight. For the coffee growers the agreement was meant to protect, the consequences were unfortunately devastating. Poverty in rural Latin America and Africa skyrocketed. In many places, prices were so low the coffee simply wasn't worth harvesting and many farms were abandoned. In Colombia, many farmers had to turn to growing illegal coca to stay afloat. The instability the United States tried to prevent became a reality anyway, though there was no more Soviet Union to exploit it. The winners are obvious, those being the big coffee-consuming countries and the big roasting companies. The profit margins for companies like Nestle and Folgers exploded. Today, if you were to buy a coffee for $5, the farmer who grew the beans likely receives less than 10 cents. Things like fair trade certifications have helped somewhat, but that's a band-aid on a pretty bad structural issue. The International Coffee Agreement was a Cold War anomaly, a rare moment when geopolitical concerns aligned to create something that, however imperfectly, tried to balance the interests of producers and consumers. It was full of loopholes and constantly on the verge of collapse, but for nearly 3 decades it did somewhat stabilize an inherently unstable market. Sadly, today, we're back to how it was before 1962, and the coffee industry today is quite exploitative towards the people actually growing the crop.
Hey, does anybody want coffee? Who wants coffee? I just made a fresh pot of coffee. Does anybody want coffee?